Hello, I'm Dr. Nazanin Munroe, and in today's lecture, I'm going to share the research in my new book, Sufi Lovers, Safavid Silks, and Early Modern Identity. The research addresses the relationship between poetry, textiles, and self-expression through dress by examining a unique group of narrative figural silks depicting lovers from the Khamsa, a quintet of epic Persian poems. Attributed to early modern Safavid Iran, these sumptuous silks are estimated to have been produced between 1550 and 1650. Safavid luxury silks were coveted across the Islamic world and Europe, selling for thousands of dollars per yard in today's money. The finest of these include metal-wrapped threads of gold or silver, heightening their value. Although figural silks proliferated in the Safavid period, which was known as a golden age of Persian visual art, I propose that this group is unique in that they represent narrative scenes from well-known epic poetry rather than the idealized figural scenes that appear on other silks of this period, therefore connecting the wearer of the textile with the character displayed. Even more compelling, 3 of the silks in this group include the signature of the textile designer, but the designers of the remaining 8 silks in this group are anonymous, so we don't know who made them or where they were produced. Therefore, I developed the following research questions. Why represent these particular characters and scenes on silk as opposed to others from Persian epic poetry? Who ultimately wore these silks, and what are the messages being communicated? Were the messages obvious to all viewers, or were they encoded messages communicating to a select few? In business terms, whether produced with royal patronage or by an independent workshop, loom-woven silks were a capital investment. We have no depictions of either men or women wearing garments fashioned from Khamsa silks, and yet we have fragments of multiple designs, indicating a trend among elite consumers. Why did designs with these characters become popular at this moment in time? On a technical level, how was the imagery for silks developed, and were painters involved in the design process? Lastly, if some silks are signed by the designers and others are not, are the unsigned versions designer knockoffs? Let's start by looking at scenes from the stories. The legendary characters depicted on silks were codified in Persian language literature almost 4 centuries earlier. 12th century poet Nizami Ganjavi authored a quintet referenced as the Khamsa, meaning 5, and known popularly in Iran as Panj Ganj, or 5 treasures. The first poem is a didactic Sufi treatise, and the following 4 poems are historical romances. Composing poetry and rhyming couplets, Nizami's enthralling tales of these lovers were also imbued with Sufi mysticism and illustrated with key moments in the narratives. Sufism, as the mystic sect of Islam, existed as a kind of initiation-based society in which the participants committed to the tutelage of a sheikh and engaged in ceremonies including poetic recitation or zikr, music and dance known as sama, and these led to a state of ecstasy. The main goal of Sufi aspirants is to direct one's spiritual path towards union with the divine, or tawhid, through a series of rituals in order to achieve selflessness, which is the basis of divine love. This can also be achieved by devotion towards a beloved. Therefore, the Sufi connection with these narratives resides in the concept of love itself. However, only 2 of Nizami's romances are depicted on silks. Both epic poems are titled after the characters. The first story, Khosrow and Shirin, dramatizes the tragic love story of 6th century Iranian king Khosrow Parviz and his Armenian queen Shirin, whose relationship began with a fated meeting on the road between their 2 kingdoms. Khosrow's love of Shirin begins as the manifestation of a prophecy which propels him into a lover's chase, but throughout the story he is transformed by his separation from the object of his affection and his love of Shirin ultimately makes him a complete and therefore enlightened being. The second story, Layla and Majnun, recounts the separation and madness of the Bedouin poet-lover Qais, known as Majnun or Madman, and his beloved Layla, whose union was prevented by their families. Majnun experiences a transformation from lovesick poet to enlightened beastmaster after he quits society to wander through the wilderness, singing poems of Layla. Thus far, scholarly focus of Khamsa narrative silks has been on the superior technical aspects of weaving complex silk fabrics that resemble paintings, a labor-intensive and highly skilled endeavor. Most scholars, though not all, have alluded to these scenes as being from Nazami's Khamsa based on similarities with manuscript paintings. The disconnect with the prevailing theories was that scenes of one set of lovers is depicting Nazami's narrative, but the other lovers are in a scene that never happens in Nazami's Khamsa. So whose story is it, and how does this change the message conveyed by the silks? We'll begin by analyzing the scene from Nazami's Khosrow and Shirin as depicted in a Khamsa from the early Safavid period. To cultivate Shirin's affections, Khosrow enlists the help of his friend Shapur, a painter, who travels to Armenia and leaves a portrait of him for the princess. Shirin is bewitched by his image and hatches a plan with Shapur to travel to Khosrow's realm. Halfway to Iran, Shirin takes a break to remove her clothes and bathe in a stream. Meanwhile, Khosrow is fleeing political intrigues in his own kingdom, and the two meet accidentally along the way, when Khosrow spots her bathing in the stream and instantly falls in love. Often referenced as the bathing scene, this moment in the story is reproduced in every silk design of Khosrow Shirin. On the left is a velvet fragment at the Met, which is a silk velvet. The piece on the right is a metal thread velvet in the Topkapi Museum. These are top-tier luxury velvets. Made in a technique referenced as voided velvet, the piece on the right, this means that some areas are woven flat and other areas have pile, creating a three-dimensional effect that would have changed color and glimmered with movement when worn. Sometimes it's difficult to read the iconography of the textiles due to fraying and fading, so I've done some drawings to show the main motifs. These are two fragments of the same textiles in two different collections, the Cleveland Museum of Art and the Metropolitan Museum of Art. Woven images of the poetry's pivotal scenes seem to mirror the iconography of paintings in Khamsa illustrated manuscripts. In the silk velvet, Shirin is almost identical to the painted image, and Khosrow is seated on his horse, holding one finger up to his mouth in a gesture of surprise. However, careful examination indicates that none of the designs are exact replicas of their painted counterparts. This discrepancy brings forth questions of whether the silk motifs were designed by master painters or textile designers. Although it is rare to have the signature of a Naqshband or textile designer woven into a design, in this case, we have three examples. The first signature is incorporated in a metal thread voided velvet depicting the bathing scene of Khosrow Shirin. Reading Amal Qiyas or work of Qiyas, this fascinating piece of evidence leads to some truths and some assumptions about this famous designer. The signature is actually backwards on this fragment due to the mirroring of the motifs during weaving. So I have done a drawing to show the proper orientation of the text. A Naqshband referenced as Qiyasuddin Ali Yazdi is mentioned in several Safavid primary biographic sources known as Tazkere, which function as a who's who of poets and artists. One such Tazkere, Jame Mofidi, has a section that reads in part, Khaja Qiyasuddin Ali was unrivaled in the art of textile design. He continuously drew marvelous things and wondrous forms on the pages of time with a thoughtful brush and completed exquisite textile fabrics. Such was the renown of his high achievement in this art that the mighty kings and rulers of India, Turkestan, and Turkey sent him precious gifts asking for textiles from the workshop of his genius. Ghiyas' signature also appears on two designs of Layla and Majnun. Although these two examples of silks differ somewhat in layout and color, in both Ghiyas's signature is placed in the palanquin carrying Layla, albeit in two different calligraphic styles, Nasq and Kufi. The two silks are executed in a compound weaving technique known as lampas and often referenced as brocades even today. These were not as labor-intensive and therefore not as expensive as velvets, but their worth is increased by the addition of metal-wrapped threads. Additional biographic references include information alluding to the fact that he was a wealthy entrepreneur who owned his own silk weaving workshop in Yazd, and that he was selected to work at the royal weaving workshops for a period of time towards the end of his career. Most significantly, Ghiyas references himself in his own poetry as, quote, an artist-craftsman as well as a poet, unquote, and proclaims, during the daytime, I am busy engaged in making decorative designs, at night in the companionship of prayer and the Quran. Many of Ghiyas's other surviving verses juxtapose his status as a renowned artist in his time with his growing interest in spirituality. The title Khwaja, applied to him by Mofidi, indicates that he has attained a high level of respect and that he is probably a practicing Sufi. From this perspective, it makes sense that he has chosen the tale of Layla and Majnun as his subject matter. From the time that Nazami codified the tale in the 12th century, the sad figure of the love-crazed Majnun, who was openly lamenting the separation from his beloved, became a prototype for the Sufi dervish, one who renounces attachment to the world in favor of finding a connection with the divine beloved, which, according to the Majnun example, could be embodied by connecting with an earthly beloved. Perhaps drawing inspiration from the signed designer textiles, the production of the 8 remaining Khamsa silks were made without signatures depicting similar imagery. These 2 silk designs are executed in double cloth. Although this technique still requires a high level of skill, they are not as material or labor-intensive as velvet or lampas silks, and therefore would theoretically sell at a lower price point. Coupled with the lack of a signature, this perhaps indicated that these were created by lesser-known textile designers who may have been producing, in contemporary vernacular, designer knockoffs. In addition to the double cloth depicting Layla and Majnun in the wilderness on the right, there are 4 additional fragments with Khamsa scenes woven in this technique. On the left, a silk with vignettes from 3 different love stories, the familiar bathing scene of Khosrow Shirin, the wilderness scene of Layla and Majnun, and the unexpected addition of another set of lovers, Yusuf and Zulaykha, known in the Old Testament as Joseph and Potiphar's wife, who were codified by the poet Jami in the late 15th century. This double cloth is epigraphic, but the verses do not seem to be from Khamsa poetry. According to the British Museum, they read, quote, sleep soundly and from our friendship, glad tidings will arise. And in the alternating cartouche, there is a lament that repeats, I. 2 additional double cloth silks are also interwoven with verses. On the right, a double cloth depicts the romance within a romance of Shirin with Farhad, who forms a love triangle with Khosrow Shirin and then gets caught in the saga with Khosrow. Likewise, the final double cloth shows the original protagonist of the Khosrow Shirin epic in the bathing scene surrounded by poetry, but none of these verses are from the Khamsa. Loosely translated, they read, in the shadow of the beloved, I am happy and fortunate because I am like a king. The last word, Khosravan, being a play on the name Khosrow, which translates as king in Persian. In addition to the brocaded silks, which are referenced in Persian as shadabaf, there are also two unsigned velvets of Layla and Majnun. Velvets are a special category of silk production. We know from primary sources that there were different types of weaving workshops and that velvet weaving is its own specialty makhmal baf, and that the use of precious metals in silk textiles were an important factor in pricing, and workshops that weave with gold or silver are referenced by their materials, zarbaf. The two examples pictured here are both luxury silk velvets, but the one on the left does not include the use of metal wrapped threads, and they are not depicting the same scene. The red design on the left shows Layla and Majnun meeting together in the wilderness where he has been wandering. This matches the other four designs depicting the couple, double cloths and lampas satins. But the other velvet does not show the lovers together in the wilderness. In Nazami's narrative, Majnun is always alone, presiding over a kingdom of wild animals that have been tamed by his gentle nature. These are two examples of Nazami's Majnun. The polychromatic painting is from a mid-16th century illustrated manuscript of the whole Khamseh, and the drawing on the left is depicting the same scene, but the object provenance suggests that it was a single image intended for an album rather than a complete manuscript. The fact that Majnun is instantly recognizable in two different contexts demonstrate that by the early modern period, Majnun was a visual signifier for the ascetic Sufi dervish. This seems to be the scene that is depicted in the velvet on the right, where you see Majnun holding a deer with a kind of dreamy smile on his face. This is a top-tier luxury voided velvet, also brocaded with silver-wrapped threads, which increases the worth of the fabric. Essentially, this is the fabric of kings, depicting the symbol of asceticism, a paradox that will be explained a bit further along in this lecture. There is very little information on the provenance of this silk velvet. It resides in the collection at the State Hermitage Museum, and the full object records do not indicate anything other than the basics of the material and dating listed here, and the date of transfer from the State Historical Museum in 1930. This silk, which may have been either gifted or purchased as a length of cloth, has been fashioned into a chasuble for a high-ranking Christian cleric. The shoulder pieces are 17th century Russian fabric, so this may be a clue as to the date when the chasuble was created. It is quite common to see silks from the Islamic world fashioned into clerical vestments from the medieval and early modern periods. Whether or not the image or story of Majnun has any resonance here within the Russian Orthodox context is not known, but it certainly indicates that these textiles, many of which are in fragmentary condition, were appropriate for apparel and were admired by consumers in other cultures. Returning to the relationship between painting, poetry, and textiles, this meeting between the lovers never actually takes place in Nazami's tale, but instead seems to be depicting a scene from a different Khamseh, that written by Amir Khosrow Dehlavi, a Turco-Hindu poet working for the Sultan Alauddin in Delhi, who penned his own version of the famous love stories in Persian over a century after Nazami to demonstrate his literary skills. In Persian, this is referenced as Jawab Gui, a literary response to a great master. Amir Khosrow complains in his introduction that Nazami has drunk all the wine and left the dregs for him. To differentiate his narrative, he changed the title to Majnun and Layla and created a different narrative arc. In his version, Majnun is married against his will, and Layla can't stand being separated from him. She breaks the rules of social decorum by going to visit him in the desert. In some silk designs, we see her camel and palanquin, which we also see in paintings of this scene. In others, she's accompanied by a servant. But in most designs, the lovers are alone. Their union in the wilderness is a distinct difference from Nezami's version of the lovers, who only meet in the presence of others at Layla's camp or in a palm grove, chaperoned by an old man. Since the Khamsa characters were well known in both Iran and India by the early modern period when the silks and manuscripts were produced, how can we determine where these textiles were produced and whether the mystic messages conveyed were the same? Sufi circles extended far beyond the borders of the Safavid Empire. From the medieval period onwards, a vast network of several different groups existed from Anatolia to Central Asia and South Asia. In the 13th century, Iranian and Central Asian settlers in the Indian subcontinent came in waves to escape the persecution of the Mongol hordes, who swept through the Islamic world from about 1220. The pagan Mongols were fierce, but they never managed to defeat the armies of the Delhi Sultans in North India, and thus the region remained free of Mongol rule, making this area a refuge for Central Asians and Iranians. The immigrants who settled in India found the Muslim government hospitable to them, and more immigrants arrived or were invited by the ruling class to service the population and their needs, including textile designers and weavers who could make luxury cloths such as velvets and satin lampas silks, which were not made by indigenous weavers. By the early modern period, several wealthy Iranians were documented as having set up several successful businesses with goods traveling from India to Iran and Western Asia, such as Mahmud Gawan. Having reached India in 1453, Gawan had already set up a commercial enterprise through Khorasan, Iran, Central Asia, Syria, and Egypt. Known as Malik al-Tujar, or King of the Merchants, Gawan made his fortune by exporting textiles. Gawan used his commercial success to establish the Deccan as a center of Persian scholarship by patronizing an impressive madrasa or school completed in 1472, which included a 3,000-volume library. This patronage, along with the establishment of Persian as the language of courtly life and literary circles, furthered the familiarity with classics such as the Khamsa. Around 1470, the Russian merchant Afanasy Nikitin wrote, quote, "The rulers and nobles in the land of India are all Khorasanians," unquote, referring to the people from eastern Iran on the border of modern-day Afghanistan, who now made up a large portion of the elite living in North India and the Deccan. In addition to seeking financial opportunities, these groups had migrated eastward across Asia, seeking spiritual and religious freedom as Sufis, to join the socially and politically powerful Khajagan or Naqshbandi order, or the Cheshti order, both of whom were well established in India by the 16th century. This also ties in with the popularity of the Majnun character, who had become a tangible representation for the Sufi dilemma of separation and union with the beloved. Ironically, the descendants of the Mongols, the Mughals, whose name is a regional pronunciation of Mongol, reclaimed this area during the 16th century, but this time with a far more open approach to building a heterogeneous community. Certainly, by the early modern period, there was a diaspora of Iranian craftsmen and nobles in India, particularly in the Deccan. One of the primary incentives for relocation was, of course, financial reward, which could mean setting up trade in precious goods or working for a royal patron. In this final wave, migration also presented financial opportunities, particularly during the power vacuum in Iran in the third quarter of the 16th century, following the end of Tahmasp's 52-year reign. Given the absorption of Iranian craftsmen into the royal Mughal atelier, how do we know that these silks weren't produced in India by Iranian Naqshbandan? Although Nazami's Khamsa is illustrated roughly 4 times as often as Amir Khosrow's, we see both versions being reproduced in illustrated manuscripts across what is known as the Persianate realm, which can be defined in brief as the region spanning Asia from India to Iran, in which the cultural idioms were dominated by Persian language and culture. The Mughals ruling in India were the contemporaries of the Safavids and produced a number of illustrated manuscripts, including those of both Nazami and Amir Khosrow. Considering that one set of Khamsa silks is related to the Iranian Nizami's versions and the others to the versions of Indian poet Amir Khosrow, this made me wonder about the place of manufacture of these early modern silks. Perhaps if there was a fluid connection between these two Khamsa manuscripts, whose texts are both illustrated and referenced interchangeably throughout the Persianate realm, there might be a tangible connection between silk production in India and Iran. In this painting, from a khamsa of Amir Khosrow produced in the Royal Mughal atelier dating to the late 16th century, we see Layla comforting Majnun with her camel and palanquin in the scene. The text in the painting is not from an illustrated manuscript of the khamsa, but a different Sufi poet. Written by 11th century poet Khaja Abdullah Ansari, it translates as, "What is dervishness? It is a little lump of fine purified soil with a sprinkling of a few drops of water. Neither is the sole of the foot irritated by it, nor does the heel of the foot collect dust from it." The fact that this scene is included with the poetry of an earlier Sufi poet indicates that Majnun is indeed the prototypical Sufi lover, and that Amir Khosrow's union of the lovers appeals to the early modern sensibility. Looking at this Khamsa of Nizami manuscript commissioned by Akbar around the same time period, we see additional similarities with the rendering of Majnun in the painting and the silk. His rib cage is outlined and showing the individual ribs, indicating his emaciated state. Here, Majnun is visited by his mother in the wilderness, a scene that is rarely, if ever, depicted in earlier manuscript illustrations with Iranian patrons. From an iconographic and material standpoint, it brings forth the question of patronage and place of manufacture, whether in Safavid Iran or Mughal India, and the messages implied by the Naqshbandan who made the silk. The message may be that union or tawhid represents a state of ecstasy. In Nizami's version, Majnun's enlightenment comes through separation, while in Amir Khosrow's version, it comes through union. It should also be noted that there are different Sufi approaches to tawhid and the ceremonial zikr, or remembrance, practiced in Sufi ceremonies. The Naqshbandi order, which became quite popular and powerful in India, favored a silent approach of worship known as khalvat dar anjuman, or solitude within society. This order had a large membership of craftsmen who were encouraged in Sufi treatises to practice this silent worship through their craft, like a kind of moving meditation. In terms of etymology, it's difficult to determine where the name Naqshbandi originated. This order started out being called the Khajagan, or teachers. Sheikh Bahauddin, who established the order in India in the 14th century, was posthumously referenced as Naqshbandi. Note the shared etymology with the word for textile designer, Naqshband. I propose that perhaps there was a large group of these textile specialists who were members of the Sufi order. If this is the connection, were these the silk designers who were proliferating the Sufi image of Majnun as a silent outward expression of faith? The representation of ideology in dress extends to the political sphere in Iran as well. The Safavids emphasized their dynastic right to power based on their genealogical connection to the Sufi order at Ardabil. Naming the dynasty after their ancestor, Sheikh Safiuddin, the descendants that controlled the shrine expanded the complex and the order over a 150-year period following his death. During the latter half of the 15th century, an increasing number of Turkmen tribesmen from eastern Anatolia joined the order. One of these Sufi sheikhs in the order, Haydar, had a dream in which Ali, the intended successor of Prophet Muhammad in Shia belief, appeared to him and described a particular headdress, a red skull cap with a baton-like extension, covered in a beehive-shaped white turban with 12 folds. This headgear was later adopted by the Safavid army as the symbol of Twelver Shi'ism, and its wearers were referenced as Kizilbash, or Redhead, indicating the Turkmen tribes who supported the Safavid sheikhs. The first Safavid ruler, Ismail, declared Twelver Shi'ism as the state religion. This affiliation was signified by the visionary headgear, which came to be known as Taj Haydari, or more popularly, Taj Safavi. The Taj was a symbol of the wearer's allegiance to the ruler, as well as signifying his approval. Although this headgear is seen often in painting from the era of Tahmasp, turbans were granted selectively and worn as directed by the Shah, sometimes accompanied by an egret indicating that produced in Safavid Iran depict Khosrow wearing a Taj in emulation of the ruling dynasty who wanted to connect themselves with ancestral Iranian kingship. See the painting on the left, in which Khosrow and all his courtiers are wearing a variation of this headwear. However, although figures in other silks of this period wear the Taj Safavi, in all the silk designs of Khosrow Shirin, this headwear is conspicuously absent. This might indicate that the silks were designed after 1587, when Safavid ruler Shah Abbas changed the turban style in order to disassociate from the Turkoman supporters who had grown too powerful. The Safavids were not the only early modern superpower to declare their divine right to rule. The Mughals also claimed that they were the rightful rulers of just rule in the dawn of the Islamic millennium in the year 1591. As the Sufi orders gained land, power, and money through Central Asia and the Indian subcontinent, they became important political constituents. Sufi groups garnered popular support, therefore rulers needed their stamp of approval to stay in power. Sufi sheikhs became advisors to the Mughal kings, marrying their wives and daughters to princes to cement this relationship. The Mughal rulers were incredibly wealthy and motivated to establish themselves as a world power, and they sought to do this carefully by crafting their self-image. This becomes apparent in the portraits that Mughal kings had painted for them. On the left, you see the early 17th century ruler Jahangir seated on an hourglass that functions as his throne, handing a book to a Sufi sheikh named Hussein, while the opulently dressed Ottoman Sultan and English King James I are unacknowledged by the Sufi king. In my view, this painting symbolizes Jahangir's inner dervish, who shares knowledge with a renowned holy man rather than vying for power on the global stage. This is supported by a quote in the ruler's memoirs known as the Jahangirnameh. In 1614, the emperor was gravely ill and visited the shrine of a Sufi Khwaja, vowing that if he recovered, he would pledge his allegiance to the Sufi sheikh by piercing his ear and becoming his ear-pierced devotee. The Safavids also created portraiture of a more subtle nature, indicating their faith and power. On the right, you see a manuscript painting from the national epic, the Shahnameh, depicting ancient Iranian king Kayqavus in the likeness of Shah Abbas. This is another example of the Safavids linking their dynasty to the past, but also adding a Sufi Islamic element in that the king is in a traditional gesture of supplication as he prays for assistance with the menacing blue dragon in the background. Abbas is wearing a crown similar to the one in the Topkapi velvet. This, in my estimation, also supports a later date of manufacture for these silks, probably during the reign of Abbas. Ultimately, both kingdoms in Iran and India are ruled by Sufi kings who fashion themselves as powerful and humble at the same time. Are they wearing the luxurious silks of Khosrow and Majnun to demonstrate this paradox of the Sufi king? One of the significant ceremonies in Iranian kingship, which is also emulated throughout the Persianate world, is the gifting of garments and accessories known collectively as khalat. Derived from the Arabic word khila, which means to take off or remove one's clothing, this tradition started in ancient Iran when the king would give away his clothing to all the members of his kingdom every Persian New Year during the vernal equinox. Shah Abbas is as involved in this tradition as his forebears. Here we see two examples of high-ranking officials or ambassadors who are dressed in fine figural silks. On the left, Robert Shirley is immortalized in two portraits wearing his Safavid khalat. While in Rome in 1622, Shirley commissioned portraits of himself and his wife by Anthony van Dyck. Seen here, Robert is dressed in a figural silk overgarment or balapouche with long narrow sleeves worn over the shoulders like a cloak. His balapouche is made of figural golden silk patterned with a design of a seated female figure holding a wine bottle and a kneeling male figure. Although the painterly style of the Van Dyck portraits offer few details beyond the curvilinear floral arabesques circling the figures, it does not appear to be a narrative design. A 1626 portrait by an anonymous artist provides a more detailed depiction of Robert's balapouche, which seems to feature a design of reclining male and female figures partaking of wine. Worn loosely over his shoulders, the balapouche falls away to reveal the intricate design of the coat underneath, a figure hurling a rock at a dragon. Other ambassadors depicted wearing figural silk include Shirley's rival, Naphtali Beck, who was sent to the English court of Charles I by the English East India Company. Naphtali Beck was depicted by Richard Greenberry in 1626 wearing a figural silk khalat in his portrait. His balapouche is also made of figural silk, which appears to be velvet, with large-scale standing male figures and life-size flowering plants. The garment underneath is fashioned from a silvery silk with a motif known as kolobolbol, or bird and flower, possibly a satin lampus. Both ambassadors sought legitimacy in the eyes of the English court and used portraiture to achieve this end. In light of the circumstances, it is significant that they are both cloaked in figural silks as the official representatives of Iran, verifying this style as the height of Safavid elegant fashion and the symbol of royal appointment. Ironically, even though Shah Abbas created a thriving silk industry and gifted silks to his courtiers and ambassadors, he himself is not documented in any visual or literary primary sources as wearing figural silks. He did, however, make a point of gifting figural silks through diplomatic offerings. Outgoing Safavid embassies always included silk textiles as a major component of the gifts. Diplomatic missions to Venice, an important commercial trading partner, were dispatched in 1600, 1603, 1607, 1610, and 1632. Among other gifts for the Doge, the delegation brought silk pictorial rugs and luxury textiles. The 1603 delegation sent by Shah Abbas was immortalized in a painting by Carlo and Gabriele Cagliari entitled Doge Marino Grimani Receiving Persian Ambassadors, depicting the Doge's men inspecting a length of what appears to be a Safavid gold metal thread voided velvet. Extant fragments from the 1603 diplomatic offering include a stunning figural Virgin and Child voided velvet. The velvet depicts a seated Mary breastfeeding the newborn Jesus in her lap, being approached by a figure, perhaps a Zoroastrian magus or priest of Iranian origin, who presents what appears to be a sumptuous garment similar to the gifting of early modern khalat. The arched flames encircling the Virgin's head are indicative of the Safavid pictorial practice of representing holy figures with a fiery halo. And here are some details of the repeat unit there. This silk velvet depicting a Christian theme further supports the hypothesis that Safavid figural silks were marketed as a way to entice European buyers to purchase Iranian silk textiles and especially silk fiber. A satin lampas figural coat in the State Armory Museum in Moscow is believed to have reached Russia as a diplomatic gift during the reign of Ivan IV and perhaps belonged to either Tsarevich Ivan Ivanovich or Tsar Fyodor Ivanovich. Though the details of the gift are not known, the robe is attributed to 16th century Safavid manufacture, and it features a figure hurling a rock at a dragon, almost identical to Shirley's khalat. The Lampas coat with the Shahnameh theme is the only other narrative theme we find in this period outside of the Khamseh. Is the Majnun velvet also a diplomatic gift, and is it even made in Safavid Iran? It was entirely possible that by the early 17th century, the textile designers in the Mughal royal workshops had learned the skills to make figural silks. According to their own records, the Mughals had attracted so much creative talent from the Persianate realm that they were producing luxury silks by the end of the 16th century, a point that is stressed when discussing textile production in the official historiography of Akbar, authored by Abu Fazl Alami in the late 16th century, Aina Akbari. Abu Fazl writes, skillful masters and workmen have settled in this country to teach people an improved system of manufacture. The imperial workshops, the towns of Lahore, Agra, Fatehpur, Ahmadabad, Gujarat, turn out many masterful pieces of workmanship, and the figures and patterns, knots, and variety of fashions which now prevail astonish experienced travelers. The imperial workshops furnish all those stuffs which are made in other countries. This phenomenon is corroborated by another of Akbar's biographers, Arif Kandahari, when he says, the king is an expert in dealing with and solving tough problems. He has provided training in the art to expert masters or ustad. Consequently, these craftsmen now produce such stuff much superior to those of Iran and Europe. Iconographic similarities in painting and the motifs in this velvet seem to create further overlap between the production of the two empires. Was the Majnun voided velvet created in a Mughal atelier by Safavid emigres or by Safavids? And was the silk gifted to the Russian court by one of these two courts or by a merchant or traveler? These drawings show the similarities between motifs and textiles and paintings completed by Safavid emigres who worked at the Mughal court. After closely examining the iconographic similarities in paintings and textiles, I came to the conclusion that shared iconography again seems to find its roots in the migration of Safavid artists to the Mughal court. Given the mass exodus of artists from Safavid Iran, which included both painters and Naqshbandan, it is difficult to determine definitively if these extant textile fragments were produced in the Mughal or Safavid realms. There were certainly figural silks in use at the Mughal court. A painting of Jahangir's son and grandson, circa 1620, depicts the future Shah Jahan holding a plate of jewels and offering his son a large ruby. Jahan is resting against a bolster, which appears to be made of dralum woven silk, depicting male figures holding wine bottles in a garden setting. But despite the opulence that figural silks represented, Mughal kings never seemed to be wearing them in these official portraits, though one can never know what was being worn off the record, so to speak, within the private walls of the palace. However, grandees at the court are documented wearing figural silks. An example is evident in this painting of four courtiers. In the upper right is a portrait of Inayat Khan, who is wearing figural silk trousers circa 1610 and holding the royal scabbard or perhaps quiver, which is also wrapped in figural silk. Figural silks were clearly highly prized in Mughal India in the early modern period. Another example resides in the illustrated historiography of Shah Jahan's reign, the Padshah-nameh. This painting on the left includes several high-ranking officials at the court, including Reza Bahadur, who is depicted in a figural silk with a golden ground. Given the mystic messages conveyed by the Khamsa silks, it would be remiss not to question whether these textiles were fashioned for robes to wear to Sufi ceremonies. In images depicting the Sama, there are no participants dressed in Khamsa silks or any other figural silks for that matter. The Sufi robe is called a khirqeh after the Arabic word kharaqa, which means to tear or rend. There is an example of a dervish in his khirqeh on the right. This is believed to have been derived from either the patched frocks called muraqah, worn by early Sufi groups as a rejection of ostentatious new clothing, or because of the spontaneous removal of these cloaks during the Sama ceremony, which is depicted in the painting on the left. Although we see several different colors used, which may have symbolic meaning in Sufi ideology, there seems to be no use of pattern. We don't know exactly which fibers were used, but wool was always preferred. This is apparent in the word Sufi, as suf is the Arabic word for wool. To my knowledge, there are no surviving khirqeh robes in museum collections from this period. This makes sense because the robes were usually handed down and probably used until they were in tatters. But after combing through a huge number of medieval and early modern Sufi treatises, many of which have their own section discussing permissible fabrics for the khirqeh, I concluded that both silk and figural designs are basically forbidden for Sufi men. This was also corroborated by several hadith, canonical sayings of the Prophet Muhammad, which forbid the donning of silk for men and discourage iconography of animate beings. There is a famous hadith about a curtain or hanging that Aisha hangs up, and the Prophet asks her to remove it, but says it's okay to make cushions out of it. Therefore, it seems that it's okay but not to be worn. Silk is acceptable as garments for women, as are patterns, but we have few paintings of women in figural silks. Additionally, most Sufi orders did not officially admit women, although they were always willing to accept their patronage, and many Sufi women have been documented over the years donating to Sufi orders. I just wanted to take a few moments to think about technology and how these precious silks may have been fabricated. Although no drawings or diagrams of drawloom technology are known to have survived from the early modern period, the attempt has been made to reimagine how these looms may have functioned. Textile scholar, curator, and manufacturer Rahul Jain is principal of his workshop in Cholapur near Varanasi in Uttar Pradesh, India. Jain has recreated the velvet drawloom and organized the weaving process so that each thread in a velvet pile fabric is attached to a bobbin. These bobbins are separated into two banks, organized by the use of a comb and a cross that keeps the order of the threads. Designs are created with the use of a pattern harness or nakhshe, which is operated by an assistant who sits at the top of the loom, lifting and lowering warp threads. For reference, Safavid silks can have as many as 400 or more warp ends per inch, so that's a lot of threads. Like the velvet drawloom, these lumpus silks were created with the use of a weaver and a pattern harness operator controlling the lifting and lowering of warp threads. It is the creation of the nakhshe that required the highest level of skill, and this seems to be the occupation of specialists such as Qiyas, who designed his silk designs by weaving his own name into the design. I just want to end this lecture with a little bit about my own path within the field. I started my career as a textile artist and designer in the apparel industry. My work was always inspired by Persian silks, and when I started studying historic textiles, I found early on that I could work out some of the ideas behind this iconography in my own studio. These are some early works exploring the idea of what may have motivated a consumer to purchase and wear a silk with the image of Layla or Majnun. This is my first piece entitled The Mystics Have Fled the Garden, and on the left you see digitized images of a Layli Majnun from a manuscript. These are screen printed and handmade garments. I worked out a few different versions of these and put together a series of performative images playing out the story, in which the extra long sleeves of the garment became the poetry connecting Layla and Majnun. The red silk is screen printed with the image of Layla herself, based on a Safavid Textiles from the 16th century, as seen in the velvet detail. The lining of the garment is printed with her words from Nazanin's poetry. Bloody my shroud, for I am a martyr, until the joyous day of my death, when I will reunite with my lover. Or in Farsi, khun kon kafanam ke man shahidam ta bashad rang roz idam. The blue silk is screen printed with the image of Majnun himself, printed with his poetic lament to Layla from the story. If only I were the dust under your feet, so I could be close to you when you send me into the wind. And I entitled this piece Permanent Madness or Selzale Junun. So although the original silks in this group are not inscribed with Khamsa poetry, I felt it made much more sense to have the characters' words peeking out from underneath the garments. Here you see the inspiration for the Majnun character. There were several iterations of the performative aspect of this work. Here, the installation view at the De Young Museum, where I did an artist residency with performance video playing alongside the garments and backdrop. And in this image, we see a garment that I made based on another slightly later Persian design. This is not a narrative design, but it's from a very famous group of Persian velvets in Copenhagen at Rosenborg Palace. And I recreated this, but in this version, I became the version, a manifestation, if you will, of the woman depicted, and the text underneath is Rumi. Ultimately, this helped me with my reattribution and my concluding thoughts on the work that I studied for my book. First is the reattribution of the Khamsa silks based on paintings and poetry. Khosrow and Shirin is coming from Nizami's Khamsa, while Layla and Majnun seem to be coming from Amir Khosrow, with the one exception of the velvet depicting only Majnun. Qiyas, as a master designer, are the other silks designer knockoffs? From a business perspective, these silks were created with different weaving techniques and materials, some of which were more labor-intensive and therefore more expensive than others. Different price points indicate a wide range of consumers, so there must have been a trend for figural silks with Khamsa characters. What we suspect but don't know for sure is whether the designer signature of Ghiyasuddin indicated increased value. Presumably, yes. Were the silks made in Mughal manufactories by Safavid emigres? Primary sources indicate the migration of Iranian craft specialists during the early modern period who trained Mughal weavers. As far as Sufi kings in Mughal India and Safavid Iran, they shared Persianate cultural idioms and appreciation for Khamsa characters. The paradox of dervish silk, renouncing the material world with luxury silk. Self-expression through dress indicates the moment of lovers uniting, but changes with each set of lovers. Khosrow and Shirin represent love and kingship, while Layli and Majnun represent separation and union. Thanks so much for listening to this short description of Sufi lovers, Safavid silks, and early modern identity. My other book publications include a book on the history of fashion in Europe and America called A Cultural History of Western Fashion, as well as a closer look at the role of immigrants in the creation of textiles and fashion called Skilled Immigrants in the Textile and Fashion Industries. I've also written a number of articles that you're welcome to look up. I hope that this has piqued your interest in this amazing group of objects and in Persian history. Thank you for listening.